Rain fell over Chicago like a slow unraveling of grief, steady, unrelenting cleansing in its cruelty. Through the city's glass towers and neon flickers, a single car cut across the night like a ghost, sleek silver and almost silent, save for the occasional splash of water against its chrome body. Inside, Henry Johnson, 43, sat behind the wheel of his Bentley, staring into the road but seeing nothing at all. He had built an empire out of logic, timing, and control. Caldwell Financial Holdings, named after his late mother's side, had become one of the most powerful investment firms in the country under his leadership. He was used to commanding billion-dollar mergers with a nod and erasing problems with a signature. But tonight, all his power had been reduced to a whisper. Just hours ago, Henry had stood tall in his glass-walled office, 50 floors above the world, watching the city buzz beneath him. And then his phone rang. "Mr. Johnson, I'm sorry. The results confirm it. You're sterile. There's no medical path forward." The word sterile hadn't just echoed, it had detonated inside him. The legacy he'd spent a lifetime preparing to pass on died in that moment. His father's voice, cold and unforgiving, surfaced like an old wound. A man leaves something behind, Henry. A name. A future. What was left now? Stock options and an oceanfront estate. His knuckles whitened around the steering wheel as the rain smeared his vision into a blur of reds and greens. He didn't feel the tears that slid down his cheeks. He didn't notice when his foot pressed harder on the gas. The city screamed around him, horns, lights, warnings, but none registered. Then, a curve. A screech, metal meeting metal, the violent crack of his world collapsing, and silence. Several blocks away, Jane Smith was heading home in her old Honda Civic windshield wipers, barely keeping up with the storm. At 35, Jane had learned to meet hardship with grace. Raised in Southside Chicago, she had known loss, poverty, and violence. Her mother had passed when she was 12. Her father? A name, nothing more. And yet here she was, a high school literature teacher, the founder of a small community youth center, and currently, a woman carrying life inside her. Twins. No one knew. Not yet. As she crossed the Roosevelt Bridge, Jane saw a flicker of flame in the distance. An overturned vehicle lay sprawled across the guardrail, smoke rising into the rain. She didn't hesitate. Slamming her car into the park, she ran, her feet slipping on the slick pavement, her heart thundering not from fear, but instinct. She climbed across twisted steel and forced open the crumpled door, the engine's heat licking her spine. Inside, a man lay unconscious, blood staining his temple. "Hey!" she shouted, shaking his shoulder. "Wake up!" No response. Her muscles screamed as she dragged him from the wreck, sparks dancing behind her. The moment she pulled him clear, the car erupted behind them, flames soaring into the night sky like some final judgment. She held him in her arms, panting rain, mixing with sweat and ash. His eyes fluttered open, stunning stormy blue, and for a second, he looked at her like he wasn't sure she was real. Then the sirens came. Paramedics took over, sweeping him onto a stretcher. A firefighter turned to Jane, notebook in hand. "Ma'am, your name." Jane looked at the broken man being loaded into the ambulance. She didn't know who he was, didn't know his pain or his past. But she knew this: she had saved a life. "It doesn't matter," she whispered, already walking back toward her car. "He's alive. That's enough." As her hands trembled on the steering wheel, she couldn't explain the connection she'd felt. She didn't know that she had rewritten both of their fates in saving a stranger. Across the city, as Henry lay in a sterile hospital bed, bruised and broken, his first memory wasn't of the crash. It was her eyes, dark, steady, fierce. Who was she? He would find out, no matter what it took. Sometimes life rearranges everything in a single breath. One heartbeat, one decision, one act of courage, and suddenly two people from different worlds are no longer strangers. They are tethered by fate, by fire, by the chance to begin again. If you felt something stirring in your heart while reading this article, don't forget to like, comment, and follow our channel for more love stories, but also stories of healing, of legacy, and of the power of choosing each other, even when the world says you don't belong here. Let's continue this journey together. The next episode will be released soon. The beeping of hospital monitors was subtle, almost respectful, like they dared not intrude on the silence that settled over Henry Johnson's body. He opened his eyes, slowly greeted by the sterile brightness of a private room at Chicago Presbyterian. His temple throbbed beneath a tight bandage. His ribs ached with every breath, and yet physical pain was nothing compared to the hollow echo that remained inside him. Not long ago, he had walked through life like a boardroom, predictable, controllable, winnable. But now, in the soft rhythm of machines and the faint antiseptic air, he realized something terrifying. He had no control left. His mind drifted not to the crash, the flames, or even the moment the guardrail gave way. Instead, it lingered almost gently on the warmth of hands pulling him from darkness. Small, strong hands. A voice through the smoke. "You're okay. I've got you." The memory of her face came in fragments, dark, focused eyes, damp curls clinging to her cheeks, skin glowing in the reflection of the fire. She hadn't looked at him like a billionaire. She hadn't looked at him like a man falling apart. She had seen a life worth saving. He sat up slowly, heart pounding, not from fear, but from something else. He couldn't explain it. He didn't even want to. He only knew one thing with certainty. He needed to know who she was. The nurse entered with a kind smile, checking his IV and glancing at his chart. "The surgery went well. Mr. Johnson, no internal bleeding. You're fortunate." Henry's voice rasped as he asked the only question that mattered. "The woman who pulled me out, who was she?" The nurse paused. "We don't know. She didn't give a name. She left before anyone could speak to her." Henry stared at the ceiling, frustration rising in his throat, but beneath it, awe. She hadn't stayed for praise. She hadn't stayed for money. She had saved him and walked away. That kind of person didn't exist in his world, but he was determined to find her. He called Olivia, his longtime assistant, red-haired, razor-sharp, the only person in his circle who knew how to move mountains without being asked twice. Henry's tone was clear when she entered his room with an iPad and 2 phones in hand. "I want you to find her, the woman from the accident." Olivia lifted a brow. "You almost died, and you want to chase ghosts." "Not a ghost. A person. She saved me. That matters." Olivia studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Give me 48 hours. Across the city, Jane Smith stood by her window, watching rain trickle down the glass in quiet rivulets. Her 1-bedroom apartment in Southside was modest walls lined with second-hand books, mismatched furniture, a broken radiator humming like an old friend. But it was hers, a place she'd carved out of chaos. Her hands rested gently on her belly. 2 lives, unexpected, unplanned, but already hers in the most profound sense. She had told no one, not the faculty at Southside High, not the kids at the community center, not even her closest friend, Lena. She hadn't spoken to Marcus, the father, since the night she told him she was pregnant. His response had been sharp-cutting. "I'm not ready to be a father." And just like that, he was gone. Jane never begged, never chased. She had learned long ago that people don't leave because they don't love you. They leave because they don't know how. But something about that night on the bridge still clung to her like a whisper. The way the man's eyes had fluttered open beneath the smoke, the way his hand had instinctively closed around her wrist. He had looked at her, not like a victim, but like someone waking from a nightmare. She hadn't even realized it then, but now, sitting in her quiet apartment, she could feel that connection humming beneath her skin. Who was he? She told herself it didn't matter. She had her students to focus on. The babies, bills, life. She wasn't in the business of wondering about strange men with haunted eyes. Still, when the wind rattled the window that night, she whispered to her unborn daughters, "You're coming into a complex world, little ones. But I promise I'll keep doing the right thing." She pressed a hand to her stomach and felt the faintest flutter in response. By morning, Olivia was back in Henry's room, her expression unreadable, but her eyes held quiet triumph. Her name is Jane Smith, 35, teaches literature at Southside High, grew up in Englewood, lost her mom at 12, no criminal record, no debt, nothing suspicious, just decent. She handed Henry a photo printed from a school website. Jane stood in front of a chalkboard mid-laugh, her hands dusted with chalk. Behind her, students leaned forward eagerly, books open, eyes wide. Henry stared at the image for a long time. She wasn't glamorous, she wasn't polished, but there was something in her smile, a quiet defiance, a warmth that felt disarming. "She didn't save me because I'm Henry Johnson," he murmured. "She didn't even know who I was." Olivia gave him a sidelong glance. "So, what are you going to do now?" Henry didn't answer right away. Instead, he traced the photo's edges with his fingers, as if afraid it would disappear. "I'm going to thank her, properly." But even as he spoke, he knew gratitude was no longer the only thing pulling him in. It was the way she made him feel human again, unseen, untitled, simply a man. And that for someone like Henry was rarer than love. Jane Smith had always found a certain rhythm in her routine, the steady pulse of her alarm at 600 a.m., 6:00 a.m., the hiss of her aging coffee maker, the rustle of lesson plans beneath her fingers. There was comfort in structure, in knowing that if she showed up, the world, chaotic as it was, might hold together for another day. But lately, something had shifted. She stood in front of her classroom at Southside High Chalk, poised mid-air, but her mind wandered. Outside, autumn leaves danced across the cracked pavement, like whispers from a different life. Inside her, students watched her curiously, sensing her distraction, without quite naming it. "Ms. Smith," a boy called from the second row, Jamal, 15, with clever eyes, and a heart still learning to trust the world. "You forgot to write the prompt." Jane blinked and smiled softly. "You're right, Jamal. Thank you." She turned back to the board, writing slowly. What does it mean to save someone? She hadn't meant to write that. Her hand lingered over the chalk. The memory of that night, now nearly a week behind her, remained vivid. She hadn't told anyone, not about the accident, not about the explosion, not about the man she'd dragged out from death's grip. It wasn't something she could easily explain. It had felt sacred. And yet, he had been in her thoughts every day since. Not because he was handsome, though something was striking in the line of his jaw, the piercing quality of his blue eyes, but because in that one moment, they had been the only two people in the world, bound by urgency, by fire, by instinct. And then he was gone. She hadn't expected to see him again. After all, he came from a world far removed from hers. His suit had been expensive. His skin was too pale for these streets. His silence was heavy with things she could only guess. What could a man like him possibly want with her? Across town, Henry Johnson sat in the back of his car as it made its way through the South Side. His driver hesitated at every stoplight, uncertain if he should be there. But Henry's mind was elsewhere, on the worn photo of Jane that now lived permanently in his jacket pocket. He had spent the past 3 days reviewing everything Olivia had found, Jane's background, her accomplishments, the community center she helped run on weekends, the scholarship programs she wrote proposals for late into the night. It wasn't just that she'd saved his life. It was that she had been saving lives long before him. People like her didn't want praise. They didn't chase cameras. They built quietly. And that quiet was louder than anything he had ever heard. Henry stepped out when the car stopped outside the school, drawing stares immediately. His tailored navy coat and Italian boots did not belong here. Children huddled near the fence, whispering. A security guard stiffened, but Henry approached calmly, asking for the principal. He didn't ask for Jane. Not yet. That moment had to be hers to decide. The meeting was brief, polite, and a vague inquiry into a possible donation to support the school. He left his name Henry Johnson, but didn't expect the weight it carried to matter here. But it did. That evening, Jane sat at her desk in the faculty office, sipping lukewarm tea. When the school secretary entered, she was wide-eyed. "You'll never guess who stopped by today." Jane arched an eyebrow. "If another parent threatens to sue over a C-, I might scream." "No," the secretary whispered, glancing around. It was Henry Johnson. Jane's heart paused just for a second. The Henry Johnson. The secretary nodded. Tall, blue-eyed, wore money like it was a second skin. Said he was interested in funding something here. Left a card. She handed it to Jane. It was embossed, cream-colored and heavy. No title, just his name, and a phone number written in what Jane could only guess was his handwriting. She stared at it long after the secretary left. Later that night, Jane sat on her fire escape legs, curled beneath her, the city flickering beneath her feet. She held the card like it might disappear. The babies stirred softly in her belly, as if sensing her hesitation. She didn't want a debt to be paid. She didn't need gratitude. But what if it wasn't about that? What if he wanted to say thank you, or something more? She shook her head, smiling faintly to herself. "Don't be foolish, Jane," she murmured. "He's a man from another world." And yet... She tucked the card inside the pages of a well-worn book on her nightstand. Not out of rejection, but because some things needed time. Space. A breath. At that same hour, Henry stood at the windows of his penthouse, looking out across the glittering city. But his gaze wasn't drawn to the skyline or the success below. It was pulled south toward cracked sidewalks and warm cornbread, toward classrooms with broken heaters, but hearts that burned brighter than any boardroom. Toward a woman whose hands had pulled him out of the fire and whose absence now burned in him like a quiet ache. He didn't know what he was waiting for, only that he was willing to wait. It wasn't the polished floors or the scent of fried okra that unsettled Henry Johnson as he stepped into Mama Joe's diner. It was how completely unfamiliar it all felt. The diner was a modest, lived-in place between a laundromat and a barbershop on the edge of Southside. The kind of place where time moved slower, where people called the waitress by name, and where no one wore suits, unless they were on their way to a funeral. In his tailored charcoal gray jacket and silk scarf, Henry looked almost absurd. He ignored the stares. The formality in his body was impossible to conceal, but his heart was uncharacteristically unguarded. He hadn't been sure she would come. Even when Olivia confirmed that Jane had agreed to meet him, he prepared himself for the possibility of being stood up. And yet, he had waited. Now seated at a small corner table, with 2 glasses of water sweating quietly between them, Henry fidgeted in a way he hadn't since he was 16, and asked a girl to dance. Only this time, there was something more at stake than teenage nerves. He was waiting for the woman who had seen him not as a brand, not as a billionaire, but as a man unraveling. The bell above the door jingled softly. When Jane Smith stepped into the diner, she didn't walk. She moved like a question he didn't yet know how to answer. She wore a simple navy dress that caught the light like midnight, and her hair was tied back in a loose bun that revealed the soft curve of her neck. Deep and searching her eyes scanned the room before locking on him. No smile. Not yet. Henry rose to greet her, almost knocking over his glass. "Ms. Smith," he said, his voice uneven. "Thank you for coming." "You're the man from the car," she replied, her tone guarded but not unkind. She sat across from him, her posture straight, her hands folded neatly on the table. He noticed she wore no jewelry or a watch, and her fingers barely trembled. "I'm Henry," he offered after a pause. Jane gave the slightest nod. "I know." There was a long, uncertain silence between them, a silence neither of them rushed to fill. It wasn't awkward. It was careful, like walking on ice. Neither was sure which would hold. "I owe you my life," Henry said finally. "That's not something I say lightly." Jane shrugged, her eyes fixed on the condensation trailing her water glass. "I just did what anyone would do," Henry said more firmly than he intended. "No, they wouldn't." He leaned forward, elbows resting gently on the table, voice softer now. "You ran into a burning car for a stranger. That's not typical." Jane exhaled through her nose, a sound somewhere between amusement and disbelief. "I didn't do it for praise or a reward." "I know that," he said quickly. "That's why I'm here." Another silence stretched between them, less strained this time. The waitress arrived with a polite smile and handed them menus. Jane didn't open hers. "You're not from around here," she said, plainly glancing at his cufflinks. "No," he admitted. "And you can tell I've never been in a place like this before." That obvious. A flicker of a smile danced on her lips, and Henry felt something in him loosen. "Let's say, no one else here is wearing a watch worth more than my car." She said it without malice, just fact. He chuckled, disarmed. "I'll leave the Rolex at home next time." "Maybe," she said, "next time, bring cornbread." Her smile lingering longer this time. Henry watched her, captivated. She was different. Not just from the people in his world, but from anyone he'd ever known. There was a gravity to her, a grace sharpened by years of hardship. When their food arrived, Jane picked at her plate, but didn't eat much. Henry barely touched his. They weren't hungry, not for food at least. "May I ask something personal?" he said quietly. She looked up. "Depends on the question. Are you okay?" The question caught her off guard. Not, "How are you?" but "Are you okay?" It was gentler, less habitual, and something in the way he asked made her pause. "I'm figuring things out," she said after a beat. "Life doesn't always unfold the way you expect." Henry's gaze dropped to her hands again. They were folded over her stomach now, protective, instinctive. "I've heard. There are rumors that you're expecting." Jane's shoulders tensed. The shield came back. "Is that why you asked to meet?" "To confirm gossip?" "No," he said quickly. "No. I only mentioned it because I understand what it feels like when your life turns upside down." Jane studied him for a moment, weighing his words. "You don't strike me as someone who knows what struggle feels like." "Maybe not in the way you do," he admitted. "But I recently found out I can't have children." That silenced her. His voice didn't waver, but she recognized a weariness beneath it, a rawness. "It changes things," he said. "The idea that your legacy ends with you." Jane nodded slowly. "I know what it's like to be afraid. That you're not enough for the people who depend on you." For a moment, they looked at each other not as strangers, not as rescuer and rescued, but as two people quietly grieving different losses under the same stars. When they left the diner, the air outside had turned crisp. A few reporters had gathered near the curb, flashing cameras like fireflies. Someone must have recognized Henry. Jane froze. "What's going on?" she whispered. "I'm sorry." Henry said, his voice calm but pained. "This is my world, but I won't let it touch you." She pulled her hand back from his, her face unreadable. "I don't need protection, Henry. I need peace." And with that, she turned and walked away, her silhouette fading into the shadows of Southside, leaving Henry standing there, not quite knowing whether he'd just taken a step forward or lost something he never had the right to hold. Jane Smith barely slept the night after their meeting at Mama Joe's. She lay in bed listening to the creak of the old radiator, her eyes fixed on the faint outline of the ceiling. The city outside her window hummed with life, but inside her apartment, everything felt still too still, almost as if time itself was holding its breath. She kept replaying the moment she walked out of the diner, the confusion in Henry's eyes. The cameras are flashing, the soft pressure of his hand in hers, and how she'd pulled away. She didn't regret it, not entirely, but there was a voice inside her, quiet and persistent, asking, had she shut the door too soon? She had known the moment she stepped into that diner that something irreversible had begun. But what she hadn't expected was for the world to notice. The next morning, her phone buzzed relentlessly. Texts from acquaintances, a call from Lena, even a student whispering in the hallway, "Ms. Smith, is it true? Were you really with him?" And then came the headline. Billionaire Henry Johnson, spotted in Southside with mystery woman. Below it, a grainy photograph, Jane and Henry outside the diner, the soft curve of her hand still half extended toward him, his expression half hopeful, half surrendered. Her face slightly turned unreadable. The article didn't name her yet, but it didn't have to. Southside wasn't a prominent place. People talked. Fast. By lunchtime, whispers turned into rumors. A few teachers pulled her aside under the pretense of concern. One parent left a voicemail that was anything but kind. "My daughter doesn't need a teacher who's sleeping with a billionaire for attention." Jane listened to the message once, then deleted it. But the words lingered like smoke. Henry Johnson sat on the other side of the city in his penthouse office, staring at the same article. The photo stung, not because of how it made him look, but because of what it would do to her. Jane hadn't asked for this. She had asked for peace, and all he'd brought her was noise. "This is spiraling," Olivia said, placing her tablet on his desk. "Blogs are speculating. Some are calling her a gold digger. Others think you're staging a PR redemption arc." Henry's jaw clenched. "Suppress it. We're trying, but it's already been picked up by 3 national outlets." She hesitated. "Are you sure you want to continue this?" "Continue what?" His voice was sharp, but his eyes were tired. Pursuing her, Olivia clarified. "Because if you do, you'll need to protect her. This isn't your usual game. She's not used to this world." Henry looked out the window, the skyline stretching endlessly before him. "Neither am I," he said quietly. Meanwhile, Jane walked through the familiar halls of Englewood High School, but they no longer felt familiar. Her students noticed her distance. Jamal, ever observant, approached her after class. "Ms. Smith, did you save that guy? The one from the crash?" Jane hesitated. "Why would you ask that? 'Cause someone said you did. And now they think he's chasing you or something." What do you think? Jamal's answer was immediate. "You're the kind of person who saves people. That's just who you are." Her throat tightened. "Thank you, Jamal. That means more than you know." But the school wasn't the only place where pressure was building. At the community center where Jane volunteered on weekends, the staff meeting that afternoon was tense. One of the board members, a well-meaning woman in a crisp pantsuit, cleared her throat. "Jane, we need to be careful with the center's image. Some parents are concerned." Concerned about what Jane asked, though she already knew. About how certain associations might affect the reputation of the programs. It wasn't said with malice, but it didn't have to be. Jane had spent her entire life learning to decode the language of polite judgment. "My personal life," she said evenly, "has nothing to do with my ability to serve this community." Of course. The woman smiled. "But perception, as you know, can be complicated." That night, Jane sat by her window again. The card Henry had given her still sat inside the pages of the book on her nightstand. She hadn't touched it since placing it there. But now, her fingers reached for it almost reflexively. She turned it over in her hands again and again. The edges were beginning to soften. Was she being punished for one act of kindness? Or was this simply the world reminding her of its limits? Henry couldn't sleep. He sat in his private library, though he rarely read anymore, surrounded by first editions and the heavy silence of too many rooms. A whiskey sat untouched by his side. On the table before him was a photograph Jane at the community center, laughing as a group of children tackled her in an impromptu hug. Someone had posted it online months ago, a snapshot of joy. How different she looked there than the Jane who had walked out of the diner last night, composed, guarded, shaken, but proud. He had caused that. And still he couldn't shake the way she had looked at him in the moment before she turned away. Not angry, not unkind, just tired. Not of him, of what followed him. The following afternoon, Jane arrived home to find a small rectangular box at her door. No note, just her name written in clean, simple handwriting. Inside, carefully wrapped, was a set of prenatal vitamins, 2 parenting books, and a small hand-knitted blanket folded tightly. It wasn't extravagant, nothing flashy, but it was thoughtful, intentional. At the bottom of the box was a card, just 2 words written in pen for them. Jane's breath caught. She closed the box gently and sat on the edge of her bed. The world outside was still loud, still intrusive. But this moment, this was something different. Not protection, not an apology, just care. And something else she couldn't be. The following Saturday, the golden haze of early autumn spilled across the cracked pavement of Southside Chicago, softening everything it touched. Street corners where sirens once echoed now shimmered in quiet light. Even the graffiti on brick walls seemed to bloom in the sun like rebellion disguised as art. Jane Smith stood just outside the Grace House Community Center, the front steps flanked by crates of donated books and bundles of coats waiting to be sorted. She had been there since morning, directing volunteers, comforting tired mothers, and reading to a group of wide-eyed children in the shade. But even as she moved through the rhythms of her world, her thoughts refused to settle. The package arrived 3 days ago. No grand gesture, no flowers, just quiet care prenatal vitamins, parenting books, a hand-knitted blanket too soft to be mass-produced. And that note, for them. She hadn't called him, hadn't written. But something inside her had shifted. Not trust, no, that would take more than gifts, but curiosity. Something like warmth. Was this the kind of man he was when no one was looking? Her fingers brushed the curve of her belly as she watched Jamal chase a group of children around the yard, his laugh cutting through the noise. The world was complicated, but there were still moments unexpected, undeserved, that felt like grace. Henry Johnson didn't bring a driver this time. He parked his black SUV a few blocks away in a lot behind a shuttered grocery store. It wasn't fear or pride that made him walk the rest of the way. It was the need to arrive without spectacle, There was something sacred about Jane's world, and he didn't want to disturb it. His shoes crunched softly over scattered leaves as he approached the gate. From a distance, he saw her hair tied back, sleeves rolled up, organizing coats into neat piles. She didn't look tired, though she had every right to be. She looked grounded, real. He waited until she noticed him. When her gaze finally lifted and found him, there was no surprise, only measured calm. She handed a clipboard to a volunteer, then walked toward him. "You came without a suit," she said, folding her arms. "Trying not to scare anyone this time," he replied, managing a small smile. Jane tilted her head, studying him like someone reading between the lines. "What are you doing here, Henry?" "I brought a donation," he said, gesturing to a box he held. "Some books, diapers, a few supplies." She raised an eyebrow. "And you came to deliver it yourself?" "I wanted to see where you come from." Jane was silent for a long beat. Then she nodded toward the center. "Come in." "But no one calls me Miss Smith here." The inside of the community center smelled faintly of cinnamon and old paper. Walls were covered in children's drawings, crayon-colored dreams, taped beside photographs of past graduates. Success stories framed in dollar store borders. Henry strolled, taking everything in. Jane watched him from the doorway, arms crossed. He didn't speak, didn't try to impress anyone. He wandered as if in quiet awe. She joined him in the small library, where sunbeams fell across sagging bookshelves. "This used to be a grocery store," she said. "We turned it into this with a few grants and a lot of stubbornness." "It feels honest," Henry said. "Like nothing here is pretending to be more than it is." "We don't have the luxury of pretending," she replied softly. He turned to her, the sincerity in his voice cutting through the quiet. "I'm sorry about what happened outside the diner. I should have protected you." "I don't want protection." "Henry," Jane said, her voice calm but firm. "I want respect. I want understanding. I like the space to exist without being reduced to a headline." "Then let me offer that," he said. "Not with cameras or press releases. Just here." She looked at him, truly looked, and saw something beyond his tailored image. He wasn't performing. He was reaching for her for something solid in a world where everything could be bought, but not everything could be held. She exhaled slowly. "Come with me." She led him through a side door, down a narrow hallway that opened into a small courtyard between buildings. A few benches, a cracked basketball hoop, and kids running barefoot through leaves like joy was something they could chase and catch. "This is where I come to breathe," Jane said. Henry sat beside her on a bench, keeping a respectful distance. "I didn't expect this," he murmured. "What did you expect?" "I'm not sure," he admitted. "But I keep discovering you're not who I assumed you'd be." "People usually assume things when they hear where I'm from," she said, tone neutral. "That's the difference," he said quietly. "I don't want to hear where you're from. I want to know where you're going." Jane's expression faltered. That question had been haunting her since the night Marcus walked away, since the babies began growing inside her, since the fire. Where was she going? She placed a hand on her belly. "I want to give them something better," she whispered. "Not luxury, not fame, just safety. Opportunity, 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 opportunity. It's a life that's not a fight from the moment they open their eyes." Henry looked at her with something more profound than admiration. "You already are." They sat silently for a moment, the kind that didn't need filling. Then, from a distance, Jamal called out, "Miss Jane, we need one more for our team." She stood brushing off her skirt. "Duty calls." Henry rose with her. "Can I join?" She gave him a look. Do you play basketball? Not since prep school. But I can fake it. You sure you can handle being beaten by a bunch of 10-year-olds? Can you handle me in dress shoes? She laughed a clear, unguarded laugh. And for the first time, Henry felt like he wasn't just visiting her world. He was beginning to belong to it, even if only for a moment. The sun had already begun to dip low behind the buildings when the final basketball hit the chain net and rolled to a stop. Jane Smith leaned against the old brick wall, her chest rising and falling with the easy breath of someone used to both running and watching. Her navy cardigan was dusted with dirt, her curls slightly undone, but her smile lingered like a secret she wasn't quite ready to share. Across the court, Henry Johnson, without his jacket sleeves rolled to the elbows, bent over with his hands on his knees, laughing. "I can't feel my legs," he gasped. "You haven't run like that in a while, huh?" Jane teased. "Not since I was trying to escape gym class in '94. She laughed again, and he looked at her like he couldn't believe the sound was authentic. He hadn't expected the world to feel this light. Not here. Not with her. But something about how Jane moved through her world unapologetic, grounded, infinitely patient, allowed even someone like him to come undone, without fear. She said, "You're not bad for a man who probably owns half of Lake Michigan," reaching for a bottle of water and tossing it to him. "Only a third," he said, catching it. She shook her head, amused, then watched as Jamal and the other kids packed up the stray balls and ran inside. The courtyard quieted, the wind picking up as dusk slipped in like a whisper. They walked together toward the front of the center. Neither of them spoke. It wasn't awkward. It was simply full. Back inside the building had mainly emptied. A few volunteers swept the floors. Someone played an old Motown record in the staff room, the sound soft and nostalgic. Jane led Henry to a small kitchen in the back where a pot of tea had been warming on a portable stove. Chamomile. "Okay?" she asked, already pouring. "Sure," he said. "However, you're secretly dosing me with something to make me forget how bad I was at defense." "If that worked," she said, handing him the cup, "I'd have fewer headaches from 7th graders." They sat across from each other at the narrow table, steam rising between them. For a moment, Henry looked at the chipped mug in his hand, then at her face in the dim light, warm, bare of pretense, lovely in a way that had nothing to do with lipstick or angles. He said, "Jane, I've been thinking about that night, the accident." Her posture stiffened just barely. "You don't have to," she said. "It's over." "But it's not," he replied. "Because it changed things. It changed me." She looked at him, cautious. "I'm not trying to make this about myself," he added. "But I want you to know, when I woke up in that hospital bed, the first thing I remembered wasn't the crash. It was your voice. Your hands are pulling me out." Jane looked down at her tea. "I didn't do it to thank you, Henry." "I know," he said. "That's why it matters." The silence between them turned quieter, deeper. She knew this was the part of the story where someone like her was expected to fall to trust too soon, to believe in the warmth just before it burned her. But Henry didn't lean in. He didn't push. He just sat there, eyes steady, offering nothing but truth. "I'm still unsure what this is," Jane said eventually, her voice measured. "Whatever's happening between us. But it can't be a fantasy. I've lived too long in the real world for that." "Then let it be real," he said. "Real means messy. I'm a billionaire whose sister thinks you threaten the family name. Trust me, I've met messy." Jane gave him a long, unreadable look. Then, to his surprise, she smiled. "Tell me about your sister." He chuckled, rubbing the back of his neck. "Victoria. Imagine me with better posture and zero patience for people who don't match the dinnerware. Sounds exhausting." "She means well," he said, though his tone carried the weight of old wounds. "But she believes in optics more than people. And you I used to believe in control, he admitted. If I could order everything neatly enough, I'd be safe. And now, he looked at her, then his voice quiet. Now I believe in chaos, because it led me to you. The tea cooled between them. Outside streetlights flickered on. The hum of the city returned faint and familiar. I should go, Henry said, standing slowly. Jane didn't answer at first. Then she nodded, walking him to the door. At the threshold he paused. The air between them was delicate now, threaded with something almost too fragile to name. You don't have to let me in, he said. Not all at once. Not even soon. But if you ever want someone to walk with you through this, through them. His gaze dipped briefly toward her rounded stomach. I'm here. No expectations. No agenda. Jane's hand instinctively touched her belly. She searched his face for signs of performance of strategy. She found none. Good night, Henry, she said softly. Good night, Jane. He stepped into the night, disappearing into the blur of headlights and drifting leaves. Jane stood at the door a long while after he left, her fingers resting where her daughters moved within her. It wasn't the storm that frightened her. It was the stillness between them. The terrifying, beautiful possibility that it could be real. The following Sunday arrived with a hush of early October skies, pale and gentle clouds hanging low over the rooftops of Southside, as if the city itself had exhaled. Jane Smith moved slowly that morning, her fingers brushing across the soft cotton of a baby onesie folded atop the dresser. It was white, with tiny embroidered stars. A gift from the center. She hadn't told them she was having twins, but maybe they just knew. Kindness, she'd learned, often came in quiet gestures. Her body ached in a way she had grown used to. The ache came from holding too much emotion, fatigue and possibility. She poured a small cup of tea and sat at the window watching the sidewalk below. Jamal and a few other teens were helping rake leaves in the park across the street, laughter floating up through the screen. And for a moment, the world felt still. Not safe, but soft. Then came the knock at the door. She didn't flinch. She just knew. When she opened it, Henry Johnson stood there holding a box, not wrapped, not fancy, just practical. I brought soup, he said. Her brows lifted slightly. Soup. Made it myself, he added awkwardly. Mostly. Jane stepped aside, letting him in without a word. He moved carefully through the threshold, looking oddly out of place in her modest apartment, tall among low ceilings, expensive wool brushing against worn floorboards. The air smelled of cinnamon and something faintly herbal. The space was small, but warm. A bookshelf overflowing. A handmade quilt on the arm of the couch. Photographs. Not many, but enough. He set the box on the kitchen counter and unpacked it without waiting for instructions. Chicken and rice, he explained, opening the container. I Googled a recipe. Burned the first batch. This one's edible. You cook? Now, she asked, amused. Only when the stakes are impossibly high. She didn't answer, but accepted the bowl when he handed it to her. They sat at the small table by the window, sunlight catching the steam curling up from their spoons. This is good, she admitted after a few bites. Relief, he murmured. I thought I'd poisoned you. They ate silently for a while, not because they had nothing to say, but because the silence had changed. It no longer felt like distance. It felt like breath. You know, Jane said, stirring her soup, when I was little, my mom used to say food was how we reminded people they mattered. When words couldn't reach, warmth could. She sounds like a woman worth knowing. She was. Jane's voice thinned, but she didn't retreat. She passed when I was 12. Cancer. She sang me to sleep, even when her voice started to go. Henry's expression softened. That's where you got it from. Got what? The way you hold people, he said. They're breakable, but they are worth saving anyway. She didn't know how to answer that. Instead, she stood and returned with 2 mugs to the cupboard. The tea she poured was ginger with honey, her way of easing the weight in the air. They sipped it slowly, the sun moving inch by inch across the table between them. And then she said it. I'm scared, Henry. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't dramatize it. But the admission landed like a glass set gently on stone. About the babies, he asked. She nodded. About raising them here. About doing it alone. About being enough. You're not alone, he said. You say that, she replied, looking him full in the face. But your world isn't mine. You come from marble floors and boardrooms. I come from corners where kids dodge bullets. That doesn't make your world less worthy, he said. No, she said. But it is harder to believe someone like you could stay in it. Henry exhaled. I've lived my whole life in a world that rewards the appearance of strength. No one ever taught me that real strength could resemble you holding everything together with duct tape and hope. She didn't speak, but her eyes said everything. And slowly, the defenses in her posture softened. I didn't think I'd want anyone involved, she murmured. Not after Marcus walked away. There it was, the first time she'd said his name aloud in Henry's presence. He knows about the babies. Jane nodded once. Disappeared the moment I told him. Haven't seen him since. But I know how men like him work. He'll show up the second there's something to gain. And if he does, Henry's tone changed. Low, steady. Then I'll protect them, she said, with everything I have. Henry reached across the table, then not to grab, not to overwhelm, but to offer. His fingers brushed lightly against hers. You won't have to do it alone, he said again. This time she didn't pull away. Outside, the day had darkened slightly. A breeze moved through the trees with a sound like old paper. Across the street, a car that hadn't been there before had been parked. Its windows were tinted, the engine idles. Inside, Jane rose to gather the dishes. She didn't notice the silhouette watching her through the windshield. A figure hunched low, a phone in hand. Taking photos, taking notes. Marcus didn't smile. He wasn't there for sentiment. He was there because he'd seen the headline. The photo. The billionaire. And now he smelled opportunity, opportunity, opportunity. Opportunity. Back inside, Henry stood in the doorway, coat in hand. Thank you, he said, for the tea, for letting me in. Jane looked at him, one hand resting on her stomach. You didn't just bring soup, Henry. No, he said. I brought a promise. And promises, she said softly, are only as strong as the man behind them. He gave a nod that didn't demand forgiveness or belief, just time. Then he left, disappearing into the early dusk, unaware of the eyes still watching from across the street. Jane stood for a long time after he was gone, her fingers tracing slow circles against the curve of her belly. She didn't say it aloud, but for the first time she thought it. Maybe he meant it. On Tuesday morning, the sun arrived late in Southside. Clouds hung low over the rooftops, and the wind carried the faint smell of something burning, dry leaves, or yesterday's headlines, no one could tell. Inside the community center, Jane moved through her schedule with a quiet precision that masked the restlessness in her chest. Something had changed since Sunday, since Henry left her kitchen with nothing but a promise, and a soft thank you that lingered in the corners of her apartment long after his footsteps had faded down the stairs. She hadn't heard from him since, and that was okay. She hadn't expected daily texts or sudden declarations. What he had offered was space, not pressure. Still, she'd found herself reaching for her phone more than once. Not to write, to wonder. She was wiping down a shelf in the library when Lena appeared in the doorway, face pinched. "Jane." Her voice was low, cautious. Jane straightened, wiping her hands on a towel. "What's wrong? You have a visitor." "Who?" "He says his name is Marcus." The cloth slipped from Jane's hand and hit the floor. For a second, she didn't move. Her spine straightened. Her stomach, not just the baby's inside, but the instinctive knot of old fear tightened. "Tell him to wait outside," she said calmly. "I'll come to him." Lena hesitated, eyes scanning Jane's face, searching for some sign of whether this would be an explosion or an earthquake. But Jane only nodded steadily once and walked toward the front doors. He was leaning against the railing when she stepped outside. Same leather jacket, same smirk, same hollow charm she once mistook for warmth. Marcus Taylor, father of the children she carried, ghost of a mistake she had buried long ago. "Well, well," he said. "You still look good, Jane." She didn't respond. "That's it." He grinned. "No hug for the prodigal. What do you want?" He shrugged, pushing off the rail, stepping closer. "Can't a man see the mother of his children?" she said flatly. "That you stopped being a father the second you left me on that sidewalk. Now say what you came to say or leave." Marcus's smile wavered just slightly. "I saw the photos. You and the white guy, the billionaire." Jane's eyes narrowed. "Is that why you're here?" "Come on, Jane. Don't be naive. A man like him doesn't hang around Southside for fun. He wants something. And now that you're in the spotlight, you think I'm part of some payout." Marcus said, his voice lower. "You're sitting on the most significant leverage this city's seen in years. Twins. A headline. A man who can't have kids, and suddenly you're glowing like a sunrise." Jane stepped back. "If you came here to threaten me—" "Not threatening," he said quickly. Hands raised. "I'm offering a chance. You and I could work on this. You know I can talk. I got friends in the press. We could spin this into something tangible. Power, influence, maybe even a settlement." Her voice dropped to a near whisper. "You're talking about our daughters." "I'm talking about survival," Marcus said. "You know how this world works." She said, "I know how you work a crack, finally breaking through the surface. And I won't let you use them. Not now. Not ever." His smile turned sharp. "That's not your choice anymore, Jane. I've got rights. You gave them up the day you walked away. No court will see it that way, especially when the fathers are finally stepping up." She stared at him, heart-pounding, hands trembling at her sides, but her voice didn't falter. "If you come near them, I will bury you in custody filings so thick you won't see daylight until they're in college." Marcus's face darkened, the smooth veneer cracking. "You think that a billionaire is going to save you from me?" "No," she said, straightening. "I'll save myself." And with that, she turned and walked back inside. But her knees only held until the door closed behind her. She sank to the floor, her back pressed against the wall, her breath coming in silent, desperate gasps. Across the city, in an office where the windows were bigger than some homes, Henry Johnson stood behind his desk, reading the email Olivia had just forwarded to him. A tabloid site. Headline: "Is Southside's miracle mom hiding a scandal?" Subheading: "Father of twins comes forward. Billionaire involved." His blood ran cold. "Get my car," he said. Henry Olivia's voice was caution and concern wrapped in steel. "Now." He didn't wait. Jane was still seated in the stairwell when she heard footsteps. Heavy, familiar. She didn't lift her head. "Jane." She knew his voice immediately. Henry knelt beside her. His suit coat brushed the floor as he sat, not minding the dust. His hand hovered over her arm. "What happened?" She didn't answer right away. Her lips parted, but no words came. So he waited. And when the words did come, They came like glass falling from a shelf. "He's back. Marcus." She nodded. "He wants to claim them, use them, threaten, everything." Henry didn't speak for a moment. Then quietly, "He won't." She turned her head, meeting his eyes for the first time. "You don't know him. Then let me know him. Let me understand what we're facing. This isn't your fight, Henry. It became my fight," he said, "the moment I cared." She blinked. "Once. Twice?" "Why are you here?" she whispered. "Really?" He didn't offer a grand speech. Just this. "Because when I imagined a future without you in it, it didn't feel like living." She broke then. Not loudly. Just enough for one tear to trail down her cheek before she buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking silently. Henry didn't touch her. He stayed, anchored, present. When she finally looked up again, eyes rimmed in red, but clear, she spoke softly. "I don't know how to fight him. Not alone." "Then don't." And in that moment, for the first time in too long, Jane felt something shift. Not the burden, but the weight of it shared now with someone whose hands didn't just hold wealth. They held promise. The morning after Marcus's return, the city felt different. Maybe it was the way clouds clung low over the skyline, or the wind pressed harder against the windows of Jane's apartment, as if trying to get in. Or maybe it was just her breath caught between memory and the fear of repetition. It had taken her years to rebuild from the collapse Marcus left behind. And now he threatened to unravel it all with a few words and the shadow of a courtroom. Jane sat at the kitchen table, her hands wrapped around a chipped ceramic mug. The tea inside had long gone cold. Across from her, Henry stood silently reading a printout Olivia had handed him that morning, Marcus's public statement. "I'm committed to being part of my children's lives. I've made mistakes, but I won't let a billionaire or anyone else erase me from the picture." Henry set the paper down with too much force. The mug trembled. "He's baiting us," Jane said quietly. "He wants attention. He wants chaos. He wants leverage," Henry replied. "And he won't stop until he believes he's got it." She looked up. Her eyes were tired but clear. "Then we don't let him." Later that day, they met Olivia in a private room at Henry's downtown office. The space was minimalist and bright, but Jane sat tensely folding and unfolding her hands as Olivia pulled out legal documents, precedents, and plans. "If you want to go on the offensive," Olivia said, addressing Jane directly, "we'll need to establish two things: that Marcus abandoned his responsibilities, and that any sudden interest he's showing now is self-serving. He has no job," Jane offered, "no fixed address, no medical support, and not once has he reached out since I told him I was pregnant." "That was 8 months ago." Olivia nodded, jotting notes. "That helps. However, family court is about perception as much as fact. Meaning, this means that Henry interjected, and he'll try to frame this as us, the rich and powerful, stealing his children." Jane flinched at the word his. "They're not his." "Henry," she said. "Not in the way that matters." He softened. "I know." Olivia leaned back. "We'll handle the legal strategy. But in the meantime, Jane, please think carefully about how public this might become." "I didn't ask for this," she murmured. "No," Olivia said gently. "But now that it's here, we either run from it or shape the narrative ourselves." Jane exhaled. "Then we shape it." That evening, they didn't return to Southside. Henry drove her to a quiet brownstone he owned on the edge of Lincoln Park, far from flashing cameras or restless headlines. It wasn't ostentatious, just elegant and calm, with dark wood accents and a small reading nook by the window. He said, "You can stay here as long as you need unlocking the door." Jane hesitated on the threshold. I don't want to hide. You're not hiding, he said. You're protecting your peace. She stepped inside. The air was warm. It smelled faintly of cedar and something clean like linen left to dry in the sun. The lights were soft. The silence wasn't lonely. She said, this place doesn't feel like you trailing her fingers across the back of a leather chair. That's because it was never for me, Henry replied. I bought it for my mother before she passed. She never moved in. Jane turned. I didn't know you lost her. Cancer, he said. The same year my company hit its first billion. I remember standing at her hospital bedside getting congratulations on my phone while her body was giving up. That was when I learned that success doesn't silence grief. She didn't reach for him, but something in her gaze did. That's the first real thing you've told me about yourself. I'm trying, he said. They spent the rest of the evening in the reading nook, an old jazz record spinning softly in the background. Jane sat curled beneath a knit blanket sipping warm broth from a mug, while Henry scrolled through articles on his tablet, his glasses sliding down his nose. The quiet between them wasn't romantic in the conventional sense. No candles, no confessions. But it was intimacy of the rare kind. The kind built slowly, earned. Jane glanced at him over the rim of her mug. Do you always carry the weight of the world like that? Do I? You wear it like a coat that doesn't quite fit, heavy and expensive. He looked up surprised, then a slow smile. That's exactly how it feels. She set her mug down. You don't have to carry everything alone, you know. Neither do you. Their eyes met then, and something unspoken passed between them. Not a declaration or a decision, just recognition of what could be, of what might be worth the risk. Later that night, as Jane lay in the guest bedroom with soft moonlight brushing the walls, she couldn't sleep. She listened to the city sounds outside, muted in this part of town, but still alive. Somewhere down the hall, Henry was awake too, with the quiet shuffle of his footsteps crossing the floor and the low hum of his voice on the phone. Not business. She could tell. Something personal. She rose quietly, padded to the door, and paused just before opening it. Through the barely cracked wood, she heard him say, No, she doesn't know yet. I'm waiting. Until it's safe. Until I'm sure. A pause. Then, no. It's not charity. It's something I owe her. Something I want. Jane's heart stilled. She closed the door gently and went back to bed. She didn't sleep. But for the first time in days, her fear had shifted. It wasn't of Marcus anymore. It was a hope. The next morning broke quietly, as if the city held its breath. Rain hadn't yet begun, but the sky was gray with promise. The windows of Henry's brownstone were fogged over from the inside, and the silence in the house was the kind that felt deliberate, like no one dared to speak too soon. Jane Smith stood barefoot in the kitchen, wearing one of the soft flannel shirts Henry had offered her the night before. Her fingers traced the rim of a coffee mug untouched. She hadn't slept much. The words she'd overheard, something I owe her, something I want, kept echoing in her mind like footsteps in an empty hall. It wasn't the words themselves that shook her. It was the tenderness in his voice, the vulnerability. And still, something in her resisted belief, because history had taught her that when men said they wanted something, it usually meant they wanted to own it, control it, rewrite it in their image. And Henry, despite everything, still carried the weight of a world she had never been invited into. She turned at the sound of soft footsteps behind her. Henry, dressed in a dark sweater and jeans, entered the kitchen with a quiet hesitancy she wasn't used to seeing in him. You're up early, he said. Didn't sleep much. Bad dreams. She didn't answer right away. Do you always talk on the phone in the middle of the night? She asked. He stilled. Just a second. But she noticed. You heard me. Only a little. Then there's no point pretending. He walked to the counter, pouring himself a cup of coffee, buying time. Jane watched him. You said you were waiting to tell me something, she said gently. Henry set the cup down, turning toward her. His face was unreadable, not because he was hiding, but because he was deciding to let go of something he'd held close for a long time. Jane, he began, then paused. There's something you don't know about me. Then tell me. He breathed in deeply. I can't have children. The silence after his words wasn't sharp. It was heavy, weighted with implication. Jane didn't move, didn't blink. What do you mean I'm sterile? He said plainly. I've known since I was 26. It's a genetic condition. My sister knows. Olivia. A few close doctors. That's it. But you never said. Because I didn't want to define myself by it, he said. I spent many years pretending it didn't matter, throwing myself into work and building an empire, telling myself I could fill the silence with steel and glass and success. He laughed bitterly. But it doesn't work. It never does. Jane sat down slowly. So when I told you I was pregnant, it shook me, Henry admitted. Not because I thought they were mine, but for the first time I wished they could be. His voice cracked then, just slightly, not enough for most to notice. But Jane noticed, and now she asked. Now I see them as something I'll never have on paper, but maybe something I can be part of if you let me. The air between them turned raw, real. Jane searched his face for signs of manipulation, but she found none, only truth. You didn't owe me that confession, she said softly. No, he replied, but I needed you to know before this went any further. Further, he nodded. I don't want to protect you from Marcus. I want to be part of your life, of theirs, not out of guilt, not because I need to fix something broken inside me, but because I choose you. Jane stared at him for a long moment, the weight of everything unspoken tightening in her chest. You say that now, she murmured. But love, real love, doesn't come when things are beautiful. It shows up when things are hard, when we're tired, scared, and unsure. Then let me show up, he said. Every day, in the dark and the light. I'm not asking you to trust me all at once. Just don't shut the door. Her throat tightened, because the part of her that had been cracked open by years of disappointment wanted to slam that door shut, lock it, deadbolt it. But the part of her that had felt safe, truly safe in his presence on that basketball court, on that kitchen stool, in that quiet guest room, that part whispered, stay. They spent the afternoon walking through Lincoln Park, the air damp and earthy fallen leaves sticking to their shoes. Henry kept close, but not too close. Jane appreciated that. His presence wasn't pressing. It was protective, like a coat you didn't know you needed until the chill settled in. At one point, they passed a little boy, no older than 5, chasing pigeons with joyful abandon. Jane's hand went instinctively to her belly. Henry noticed. Have you ever thought about what they'll be like? He asked. Every hour, she said. And I'm terrified I'll get it wrong. You won't. How do you know? Because you're already asking that question. She didn't respond, but her eyes shimmered just a little. Back at the brownstone that night, Jane stood on the balcony wrapped in a long wool shawl. The sky above was bruised purple, the dusk that felt like the world pausing mid-sentence. Henry joined her without speaking. They stood there in silence until she finally said, If I let you in, it can't be halfway. I wouldn't want halfway, he said. Then you need to know something else. She turned to him, her voice steady. If Marcus pushes this, I will fight with everything I have, and I won't let my children become symbols for any man's redemption. Not his, not yours. They won't be, Henry said. They'll just be loved. Jane closed her eyes, and for the first time in weeks, let herself believe it might be possible. The air inside the brownstone was warm, with the scent of roasted rosemary and garlic. Jane moved around the kitchen sleeves, rolled up her belly slightly in the way, as she stirred a pot on the stove. A quiet jazz record played in the background, Ella Fitzgerald melting like velvet through the speakers. It was the first time in weeks she'd cooked for someone else. It felt strange. Not wrong, just unfamiliar. Henry leaned against the doorframe, his sleeves similarly rolled up, watching her with the quiet reverence of someone who knew not to interrupt something sacred. You're a long way from takeout, he said softly. Cooking calms me, she replied, still stirring. Always has. Even now, she glanced down at her belly, the gentle swell where two lives grew beneath her ribs. Especially now. He walked over and set the table without being asked. Simple white plates, mismatched cloth napkins from a drawer she hadn't opened since arriving. For a few minutes it felt like they were already a family. But as they sat across each other, spoons tapping lightly against ceramic, Jane could feel the heaviness creeping back in. It always did, after moments of softness. The mind trained to expect loss begins hunting for shadows. Do you ever feel like you're living someone else's life? She asked, not quite looking up. Almost every day, Henry said without pause. Even now, especially now. Their eyes met something in the echo of their words, turning the space between them into a mirror. Two people who had built entire worlds from solitude now dared to wonder what shared soil might feel beneath their feet. Jane pushed her plate away, her appetite fading. I've been thinking about what Olivia said. Henry set his fork down, bracing. About Marcus. She nodded, about going public. He didn't answer right away. Are you afraid? He asked finally. Yes, she said. But not for me. The girls. Yes. And what will it take from them? From us? Henry leaned forward, elbows on the table, fingers threaded together. Then we don't do it unless you say so. Jane studied him. It's not just about me anymore. That doesn't mean you don't get to choose. You've built your entire life in a glass house, Henry. You know what the press is capable of. I do, he said. And I'll take every hit they throw. And what about me? What happens when the world sees me not as a woman teacher or mother, but as a scandal? A headline. The black woman carrying the children of two men, one vanished and one too powerful. Henry's jaw tightened, his knuckles white. Then I stand beside you, Jane. And not because I need to save you, but because I believe in you. Her chest rose slowly. You don't get to protect me from the world unless you're willing to face it with me. I am. She didn't speak for a moment. Then quietly, then we do this. On our terms. The next morning, Olivia arrived at the brownstone with a plan. A sit-down interview. Trusted journalist. Pre-screened questions. One narrative truth. Not a scandal. Not pity. Just clarity. It's risky, Olivia warned, but it gives you control. Henry glanced at Jane. She nodded. Then we start, he said. 3 days later, the cameras were set in a quiet room, lit with soft gold and cream. No microphones clipped onto lapels, just small ones, hidden beneath cushions and collars. The air was hushed. The journalist, a poised woman in her 50s with kind eyes and a steel mind, smiled gently at Jane as they sat down. Take your time, she said. Say only what you feel ready to speak. And Jane did. She spoke of being a teacher, of working in underfunded schools, of trying to teach kids how to dream when the world had already told them not to. She talked about the community center, about Jamal, about the babies she had never expected but couldn't imagine living without. And then about Marcus. "I loved him once," she said. "But love isn't always enough. And sometimes it closes your eyes to the harm that comes dressed in charm." She didn't cry, but her voice cracked once when she added, "When I told him I was pregnant, he left. Not just physically, but emotionally, completely. And I decided that night to raise them with or without anyone." The journalist leaned forward slightly, and Henry Jane paused. Her eyes shifted to where Henry sat out of frame but not out of reach. "He didn't come into my life with promises. He came with presence, and that's harder to find than love." The interview aired 3 days later. There were headlines, of course. Some kind, some cruel. Speculation flooded forums and comment sections. But for the first time, Jane felt she had carved her story out of the noise. Not perfectly, but honestly. That night, Jane sat alone in the guest room. Lights dimmed, the babies kicking softly against her ribs, like tiny declarations of life. A knock at the door. "Come in." Henry stepped inside, holding 2 glasses of water. "Doctor's orders," he said with a small smile. "For me or the twins? For all 3 of you." She took the glass. He didn't leave. Instead, he sat down at the edge of the bed, not touching her, just staying. "You okay?" he asked. "Tired," she admitted, "but not broken. You were never broken." She looked at him then, not like someone seeking reassurance, but as someone measuring the truth in his face. "You stayed. I told you I would. Most people say that, and most people aren't like me." For a moment, neither spoke. The quiet stretched between them, soft and thick. "What now?" she whispered. Henry reached out, then his fingers brushing her knuckles. No urgency, no claim, just a touch. "Now we build something that can't be undone by headlines or threats, one moment at a time." Jane didn't say yes. She didn't need to. Her hand closed around his, which was answer enough in the dark. There was something in the stillness of the morning that felt false. The sun rose too slowly, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors of the brownstone. The wind carried no bird song. Even the city, which usually woke with the distant hum of traffic and life, seemed hesitant, like it too was waiting for something it couldn't name. Jane felt it in her bones. She moved through the kitchen in silence, barefoot, arms wrapped around her belly. The girls had been restless the night before, their small bodies shifting constantly, as if they sensed the same unspoken tension tightening around her. Henry hadn't said much since the interview aired, not because something was wrong, but because everything suddenly felt exposed. Too many eyes, too many opinions, and not enough space to breathe. Still, she had no regrets. For once, her story wasn't being told for her. She had spoken it, shaped it. That mattered. But something else stirred underneath it all. A weight she couldn't explain. By mid-morning, Henry was pacing in his study, his phone pressed to his ear, and his eyes narrowed. "And you're sure?" he asked, voice low and clipped. A pause. "No. I don't want this to go to Jane. Not yet." Another silence, then. "Yes. Keep me updated." Discreetly. He hung up, rubbing the bridge of his nose with 2 fingers. Olivia had called. She'd uncovered something. Something Marcus had buried years ago under a false name and sealed records. A restraining order, filed by a woman in Atlanta. Abuse allegations, dismissed on paper, silenced off record. But the evidence was enough. Enough to fight him, enough to destroy him, and enough to make Henry's pulse thunder in his ears. Why didn't she tell me she was afraid of him in that way? But deep down, he already knew the answer. Jane didn't trade in sympathy. She didn't ask to be saved. She built her life around resilience, not rescue. That's what made her different, and what made loving her terrifying, because she didn't need him. She had chosen to let him stay. That evening, Jane stepped out for the first time in days. She wanted real air that wrapped around you like memory and whispered of lives continuing beyond four walls. She walked down the quiet, tree-lined path near the edge of Lincoln Park, one hand resting over the curve of her stomach, the other tucked into her coat pocket. She didn't notice the man watching from across the street, didn't notice the camera flash, didn't see the figure slink back into a black sedan license plate's already obscured engine purring low. By the time she returned, Henry was waiting for her on the porch. He didn't speak immediately, but when he did, his voice was calm, careful. "We need to talk." She froze. "Is this about Marcus?" He nodded. "There's something I didn't tell you." Her eyes searched his. "What is it?" He handed her a folded file, plain but heavy in her hands. She opened it slowly. Read. And everything inside her turned to ice. They sat across from each other at the kitchen table again. But this time, no food bridged the space between them, only silence and memory. "He hurt her," Jane whispered, "that woman in Georgia." "He did," Henry confirmed, "and he covered it up." "He'll do it again," she said. "If not to me, then to them." Her hand gripped the edge of the table until her knuckles went pale. "He won't get the chance," Henry said. "We'll bring this to court. We'll file for complete custody protection. We'll expose him." Jane looked up sharply. "You'll expose him," she repeated. "Yes. And what happens when your name is dragged through the dirt alongside mine? When they paint this as some elite power play, the billionaire taking children from their struggling black father Henry didn't flinch. Then let them. I've faced worse, but I haven't." Her voice was soft, not weak, but tired. "So tired." "I know," Henry said gently, "and I hate that you have to." A long pause passed between them. Then, "This isn't about saving you, Jane. It's about standing with you because you shouldn't face this alone." Something behind her eyes cracked, but she didn't cry. Instead, she stood turned and walked to the living room. After a beat, he followed. He found her standing in front of the fireplace, one hand pressed to the wall, her back to him. "They deserve better," she said. "They'll have better," he promised. "Will they have you?" Her question wasn't romantic. It was real, grounded in fear and longing and the terrible weight of history repeating itself. Henry stepped forward, slowly, deliberately, and when he reached her, he placed his hand gently atop hers on the wall. "If you'll let me be there." She turned, and for once she didn't hide her tears. Later that night, as the rain finally arrived, soft, steady like forgiveness, they lay together on the couch silently. Not lovers, not yet, but something far more delicate. Two people on the edge of something fragile, but true. And for the first time, Jane rested her head against his shoulder, letting herself lean just a little. Outside, lightning flickered like the past clawing at the sky. But inside, the storm was quiet. For now. The courtroom didn't look like how Jane had imagined it. There were no chandeliers, no grand pillars like the ones in television dramas. No dramatic gavel strikes, just beige walls humming fluorescent lights and the bitter scent of old paper and coffee that clung to every corner of the family court building. The judge's bench sat elevated like a throne, but everything else felt so impersonal, cold, indifferent to the fact that lives were being dissected in this very room. Jane sat at the plaintiff's table beside Olivia, fingers pressed tightly around the silver pen she always kept in her bag. It didn't write anymore. She didn't need it to. It was just something to hold on to. Across the room, Marcus leaned back in his seat, smug and calm, in a cheap gray suit that wrinkled at the elbows. His lawyer, an opportunistic man with the eyes of a fox and the grin of a salesman, whispered something into his ear that made Marcus chuckle. Jane's stomach turned. The door opened, and Henry entered. He moved through the room like the air shifted for him. No suit today, just a dark wool coat over a simple sweater. Understated, unbothered. But his gaze locked with Jane's instantly, and something passed between them, not just solidarity, but silent reassurance. You're not doing this alone. The hearing wasn't meant to settle everything. It was just a preliminary, a chance for Marcus to contest paternity for lawyers, to present early arguments for the court to determine whether full custody could even be petitioned before the birth. But it was still a battlefield. Marcus's lawyer went first, painting him as a man who'd made mistakes, but had every right to repair what had been broken. He called Jane a hard-working woman of modest means and nodded condescendingly, as if that made his client's absence less vile. Then came Olivia, and she didn't mince words. She laid out the timeline, the silence, the abandonment. She submitted the report from the woman in Georgia, the sealed records of emotional abuse and financial manipulation. Every document was laid bare. And then, almost as an afterthought, she slid a photo across the table. Olivia said this was taken last week. Your Honor, when Mr. Taylor followed my client through Lincoln Park without her knowledge. The judge raised an eyebrow. Marcus's smirk faltered, but it was Jane's voice that finally broke through the noise. She stood not instructed to, just moved. She said, I'm not here to keep my children from their father. I'm here to protect them from a man who left when I needed him most, who sees them now, not as lives to nurture, but as leverage. Silence followed. Not hostile, just quiet. Then the judge spoke. No ruling yet. No decisions. Just a single sentence. I'll be reviewing this closely. Until then, all parties are instructed to refrain from public commentary or contact. Jane exhaled. The first battle had begun. That night, the brownstone was darker than usual. The rain returned heavier now, drumming on the windows with a rhythm that felt like time running out. Jane stood at the window, arms wrapped around herself, watching lightning curl across the sky like veins of fire. Henry came up behind her. Not close. Not yet. He knew when to wait. You were brilliant, he said softly. She didn't answer. Jane. She turned slowly. Why do you stay? She asked, barely audible. I mean, stay. He stepped forward, the faint scent of rain and cedar clinging to him. Because this, he gestured between them, is the only thing that's ever felt like home. Like it means something beyond business, beyond survival. She shook her head slightly, voice breaking. You could walk away. Nobody would blame you. You're not the father. You don't owe me anything. No, he said, gently stepping closer. I'm not their father. But that doesn't mean I don't love them. Her breath caught. You love them? Yes, and I love their mother. It wasn't a grand declaration. No swelling music, no kiss in the rain. Just 3 words said as plainly as a fact, as undeniable as the sun. You don't have to say that, Jane whispered. Not to make me feel safe. I'm not saying it for safety, he replied. I'm saying it because it's true. Her hands trembled. But what if I can't give you a perfect ending? Then we rewrite the ending together. Later that night, they sat silently on the living room floor, backs against the couch, a blanket draped over their legs. Jane leaned her head on his shoulder. I've never let myself hope this much before. It's terrifying. Yes, it should be. A pause. But it's also how you know it's real. She closed her eyes, and for the first time in years, She didn't brace for the pain that might follow joy. She just let the joy be, even if it was borrowed, even if it was fragile. Because tonight in the quiet, she wasn't just a woman fighting for her children. She was a woman letting herself be held, not because she was weak, but because she was finally allowed to stop having the world up alone. The hospital room was quiet, except for the rhythmic beep of monitors and the faint whisper of wind brushing against the frosted window. It was early, barely dawn, the kind of hour when the world was still deciding whether to wake or continue dreaming, and Jane's sweat still cooling on her brow, tears drying in the creases of her face, held her daughters in her arms for the first time. Two tiny bodies swaddled in soft cotton, breathing, as if they'd never known a world that hurt. They were perfect, not in the way of symmetry or tradition, but in the way all beginnings are. "Hello?" she whispered, her voice raw from labor and wonder. "You're here. You're real." One baby stirred, tiny fingers curling around her pinky like a secret being kept. She didn't notice Henry enter the room until he was beside her. No words, no fanfare, just presence. That had always been his gift, not fixing things, not rescuing her, but standing still when everything else was moving too fast. "They're here," Jane said, voice shaking, "and I don't even know how to be what they'll need." Henry sank into the chair beside her. "You already are." She turned to him, eyes rimmed with exhaustion, hope, fear. "I'm still scared. So am I." A beat passed. "But fear doesn't get to decide how this ends," he added. Later that morning, Olivia arrived with a court clerk in tow. Marcus had withdrawn his petition hours before the twins were born. Not publicly, quietly. He had seen the footage, the growing media backlash. He'd read the interviews, watched Henry beside Jane at every turn. He folded when Olivia quietly threatened to unseal records that he thought would be buried forever. Olivia confirmed he won't come near them again, signing the final papers, not without a judge and a dozen barriers between him and your daughters. Jane didn't smile, but she exhaled, and for once it didn't feel like survival. It felt like relief. The following days blurred into each other like watercolor bleeding across canvas, feeding swaddling soft lullabies at midnight. Jane's body healed in slow, aching stretches. Her mind is faster. Henry never left. He didn't try to take over. He just learned how to fold the blankets just right, how to cradle two babies at once without panic, how to fall asleep in a rocking chair at 3 a.m., without complaint. No declarations, new rings slipped onto fingers, or grand promises sealed beneath moonlight. But one morning, Jane awoke to find a journal on the nightstand. Inside, Henry had written letters to the twins, one for each day since their birth. Little things, how they curled their toes, how one hummed in her sleep, how Jane looked when she whispered their names. "I don't know what to give you yet," he wrote, "but I can give you the truth of who your mother is." She stood taller than storms, softer than fury, braver than history. Jane cried then, not because she was broken, but because she was finally held. On the twins' 1-month mark, Jane brought them to the community center. Jamal met them at the door, eyes wide as saucers. "Miss Smith," he gasped. "You brought both of them." "Both of them," she smiled. "Want to hold one?" He froze, then nodded. Carefully, reverently, he held one of the girls, cooing softly, as if she were made of glass and wonder. Henry watched from a distance, hands in his pockets. Not inserting himself, just present. Always present. As spring warmed the city's edges, Jane stood again in front of the same classroom door she had once feared. Only this time, she wasn't alone. Henry held one carrier. She held the other. Inside the gold plaque still read, Richard Harrington III, class president. But Jane no longer felt small here. She belonged, because she had rewritten what belonging meant. Some stories don't end in grand finales. They end in choices, in early mornings filled with laughter, in hands that reach for yours when you're too tired to reach back, in the tiny breaths of children who carry your name and courage into a world that still learns how to be kind. This was never just a story about motherhood, love, or survival. It was about what happens when you stop choosing fear and begin choosing presence. Every day, again and again. And if this story moved you, if something in Jane's quiet strength or Henry's steady love stayed with you, know that this story deserves space. So if you'd like to see more moments where resilience meets romance, where real people shape their endings, leave a like. Share your thoughts in the comments. Follow the channel for more stories where love unfolds slowly, honestly, and with heart. Because sometimes, the best love stories are the ones we almost didn't believe we deserved until someone stayed long enough to prove otherwise. The end.